Mixing can be tricky and overwhelming, but it can be the difference between having a hit and a flop. So in this video, I'm going to show you 3 rules for getting the perfect mix every time, including the optimum levels for your mix, what you should be mixing first, how to gel everything together in your mix and get it sounding pro, and much, much more. I've personally used this technique to mix thousands of songs over the past 25 years, and it takes out most, if not all, of the guesswork. And when combined, using all these 3 rules have helped my Accelerator students get signed to some of the world's biggest labels, and more importantly, just make music that they actually like and that they're proud of. You can also download my personal mixing template below this video. I use it for every track I start. As I said, it's taken 25 years to develop, and even if you don't have Ableton, I've included a worksheet so you can follow along and set it up in whichever DAW you use. I was going to say DAW you use, but that was too difficult. Okay, without further ado, let's hop into the DAW and get it done. So rule number 1 is starting from the end. Most people don't really think about mixing this way, but if you don't know where you're headed, how are you going to get there? You wouldn't start a car journey if you didn't know your destination, and it's exactly the same with mixing. So here are a couple of ideas for how you can start from the end. The first is use a reference track in the same genre you're producing with a lot of the same kind of sounds, as this will give you something to benchmark your mix against. Now, every full-time producer I've ever met uses reference tracks, and every student I've taught that doesn't take my advice on this invariably comes back a year later and says, I wish I'd just listened to you a year ago. Every single time. So once you've chosen an appropriate reference track, here's how you set it up. Create a blank audio track in your DAW and drag in your reference track. Next thing to do is go in and make sure it's synced to your project. The easiest way to do this is to simply look up the tempo of that track on Google, and then if you're using Ableton, just warp it and make sure that you've got the correct tempo set in, and that the start marker is at the first transient of the track, and it should all be synced up and sound like this. Lovely. Next thing to do is put a spectrum analyzer on that channel. I really like to use Span by Voxengo. It's completely free. It's a great spectrum analyzer. Next thing to do is to reduce the volume of your reference track by 12 decibels. We're actually looking to get the average volume rather than the peak to -18. So I'm going to use this completely free Ulian loudness meter. Now I want to make sure that at the busiest point of our reference track, we're hitting about -18 on this LUF scale in this loudness meter. And we can see here that it's actually a bit below that, so it's not always going to be exactly -12, but the closer you get to about -18 average volume, the better. That looks pretty good to me. And this is really important because our reference track has already been mastered. So unless we account for that extra loudness, it's going to be very difficult to compare frequency levels between the reference and our track. Ours isn't mastered yet, so we're not going to be able to get it as loud as the reference track. Now, your ultimate goal should be to get your mix sounding as good as your mastered reference track. This will A, stop you relying on the mastering process to fix a bad mix. And it also means that when you finally do get your track mastered, it's going to sound incredible. It's the same idea as athletes who train at high altitude. They recalibrate their bodies to perform. When they come back down to sea level, their bodies are used to performing with less, so they can absolutely dominate their competition. And this leads me on to the second part of rule 1, which is we want to be aiming so our mix hits about -6 on the master channel. Now, it doesn't have to be completely accurate. If it's -4 or if it's -8, it really doesn't matter, but this means that there's plenty of headroom on our master channel so it can go into the mastering stage. It's so common to see producers mixing too loud, and the main reason that is that whenever you load in a sample and preset, most of them have been normalized to be hitting 0 dB. And this means that as soon as you've got more than a couple of sounds playing simultaneously, you're very likely going to end up clipping on your master channel, which leads to unwanted audible distortion. Here's an example. So when we load our kick in, it's automatically peaking at 0 dB. Sounds good, right? Nice and fat. We can see we're just about hitting 0 on the master channel, but let's bring in the clap next. And we can see we're already clipping, and we don't have any of the vocals, any of the synths, any of the basses in, and we're already clipping over 2 dB over 0 on the master channel. Now, the simplest way to do this is whenever you load in a sound that is hitting at 0 dB, if it's been normalized, just reduce that volume to -12 as soon as you load the sound in. And I'll show you the other benefit of that now, and that's so you can use analog modeled plugins and get the best results from them. So if we want to use a distortion unit, for example, let's load in the Decapitator by Soundtoys. If we have our kick reduced to -12, when we're using it, we're kind of hitting the sweet spot, and we can control how much we want to distort this sound by. Now let's look what happens when our kick is actually at 0 dB. Even at the minimum drive of our analog model plugin, we're already really pushing that effect very hard. So those are the two reasons why it's a great rule of thumb. Just load in your sound and reduce it to -12. And again, as just shown, it's important you do that at the beginning of the signal path rather than on the mixer channel, because that's after any effects you're going to be putting on. I know that's going to confuse some of you, so please take the time to rewatch this bit until it really sinks in, because it's very important for getting excellent mixes. Now, anchoring your kick to -12 dB is the most important of all of them, and you'll find out why in a couple of minutes. Okay, so now let's get on to rule number 2. This will transform your tracks from sounding dry and boring to give them life and clarity and just gel them together, give them cohesion. So mixing rule number 2 is make space. Mixing is all about making space for every element in your mix. Our 3 main controls over that are with volume, frequency, and time. If too many sounds are playing the same frequencies at the same time, our mix is going to end up muddy, cluttered, and amateur sounding, as everything is fighting for the limited amount of space in the mix. And here are the 3 main tools we have for controlling these elements. So the main ways we can control volume are by simply muting elements or deleting them like this, by adjusting the volume of them, or by using a sidechain compressor, the most common use of which is to duck the bass against the kick, which gives us this effect. This is off, and this is on. But we'll also touch upon a game-changing advanced sidechain compression technique in rule number 3. Frequency is controlled predominantly with EQ, although some tools control both volume and frequency like saturators. But the easiest and quickest way to make space with regards to EQ is just to filter out everything under about 100 to 120 Hertz that isn't your kick and bass. So in this example, you can see this percussion loop, I filtered out everything out. With the synths as well, we filtered out everything under 100 Hertz. And that just allows space for the kick and bass to breathe through the mix. Now, time is controlled with spatial effects like reverb and delay. They also help you to place your sounds in a virtual physical space, which makes them sound more natural to our human ears, as opposed to who else's ears? The danger with reverb and delay, though, lies in ending up with a muddy, washed out mix if you use too much or don't treat it right, or if you use too little and your mix ends up sounding dry, unnatural, and a bit boring. So how do you find that sweet spot and rein in the optimum amounts? Well, this really hinges on using auxiliary channels, instead of using separate reverbs and delays on the individual channels. Now, here's the caveat. There are certain situations where you might want to do that, like if you're creating a reverb wash leading up to a drop, but generally speaking, setting them up on your auxiliary channels will give you way more control, as we're about to see. So the first step to using reverb like a boss is to set up a dedicated room reverb channel. This is what will transform your mixes from sounding thin and dry to glued together and cohesive. Now, you do this by creating an auxiliary channel, and if you're using Ableton Live, it's called a return track, but it means exactly the same thing. So you create one, add on a reverb of your choice, make sure that the decay time is under half a second long, and have as little pre-delay as you like. Then we, once again, are going to take out all of the frequencies below about 100 Hertz to avoid mud in the mix. Now we can feed a little bit of multiple elements into that room reverb, and it's going to make it all glued together and sound cohesive, like it's all coming from one space. So this is what our track sounds like with no room reverb. And now let's listen to it with. Hear how much drier and boring that sounds compared to this? It's as simple as that. Now, I want to show you how you can set that up if you're using Ableton's drum rack. So really quickly, let's go into the drum rack, because we want to be able to feed in, as we can see here, a little bit of room reverb to each separate drum, because some drums are going to want more than others, and you do this one by one to taste. So in Ableton, you click this routing button here, make sure that the R button is selected. You can right click, create return chain, and then select your room reverb from the drop down menu like so. Then you can close all that up and just make sure the S button is selected, and that allows you to send reverb just to the separate drums. That's a little quick one just for Ableton users. The second main method for reverbs is to set up your longer hall reverbs on dedicated auxiliary channels as well. And generally speaking, having more than 2 different hall reverbs in a track will often lead it to sounding muddy and washed out, because there are too many lengths of reverb tail competing with each other. So let's look at an example for dialing in some hall reverb on our vocals. So we've got our vocals here, and let's just listen to it without any reverb factored in. We've got some decay there, but we can touch upon that in a second. So let's look at our Hall reverb channel for the vocal. We can see we've just created another return track, named it vocal reverb, added a reverb, but made sure that our decay is quite long. Now I've made this 8 seconds, which is a long decay, but that's the vibe I want on this track. We've made sure it's 100% wet, same as with the room reverb, to make sure that we're not doubling up the dry signal. I'm just giving it a little bit of a volume boost and once again taking out the low end so we don't end up with a muddy mix. And this is a special little tool that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. So now let's feed some of this vocal reverb onto the dry vocals. Sounding much better, but you'll notice that we kind of lose some of the dry vocal. It almost gets washed out when you're using a lot of reverb. So listen to this. It's a bit too much. So let's flip back to a couple of minutes ago when I mentioned this advanced sidechain compression technique. This is what we're going to do. We're going to add another sidechain compressor on the reverb channel after the reverb. Let's turn it on. We're going to take the audio after pressing the sidechain button from the dry lead vocals. And what we're going to do is duck the reverb when the dry vocals are playing. And that's going to allow those dry vocals to cut through the mix before the reverb fills out the spaces in between the vocals. So let's have a listen to that without. And now with on. So let's take the threshold down so you can hear a really extreme example so you can really hear what's happening. So we can hear as soon as the dry vocal stops playing, that vocal reverb comes back and fills the space. Now we want this to be quite a subtle effect usually, just a couple of dB of gain reduction. But it just allows that vocal to really pop out through the mix. Can you hear how it allows the dry vocal to really pop through the mix? This was a game changer for me and it allowed me to work with more high profile artists when I figured this out. And we can also use that exact same technique on the vocal delay. So we've got a second auxiliary channel set up for the vocal delay and we've got another sidechain compressor doing exactly the same thing. So let's feed some of that vocal delay in. And we can see that we're ducking it slightly whilst the dry vocals are playing. That's a classic trick. Okay, rule number 3, mix in order of importance. If you have 40 or 50 channels in a mix, it can be extremely overwhelming. How do you know where to start? What do you mix first? Which elements take precedent over other elements? It would be like having 50 ingredients for a meal and no recipe to follow. Well, this next rule simplifies everything. It's my top-down mixing approach. And it works in conjunction with everything else we've covered so far today. All it means is starting with the most important element of the track, then mixing the second most important element until it's sounding good with the first, then bring in the third most important element and make sure it's sounding good with the first two, and so on until your track is mixed. Think of it this way. If we had a jar, and there is a jar here by the way, just use your imagination, and we wanted to fill it with ping pong balls and they're all the same size, we'll very quickly run out of space. And the only way we could fit them all in is to just crush them in. Now picture this. If some of our elements are bigger, like softballs or tennis balls, we can put those 3 or 4 things in first and then shrink down the ping pong balls to dried peas and then put those around these bigger elements in there and then it all fits. That's a really good analogy, despite what you may think. Okay, so let's look at an example. So you remember I said to anchor your kick at -12 dB? Well, congratulations, you've mixed your first element. So now, what's the second most important element, then the third and the fourth, and then everything else? Next most important thing we want to mix in is the bass. Until we just get those two things working really well together. If you get that wrong, your track is doomed. Next most important element would be the main clap or snare. And then your lead synth or vocals. Now in this track, I've got vocals and a lead synth. So I'll do the vocals first, and then the synths. From that point on, it's just bringing up everything else in order of importance. So after that, I would probably do the hats. And then bring everything else, as I said, up in order of importance, just making sure that it works with these core elements that are already mixed well together and sounding good. Now you might find that you end up ditching some tracks because they're just not bringing anything to the table. And that can actually be a great thing because it means your final mix will end up being both cleaner and louder. So if you always bear these 3 rules in mind when you start any mix, they will allow you to mix faster and with less confusion than any other method I've tried. Now they're a great starting point, but there are actually 14 other mixing strategies that, when factored into this framework, changed my life forever. I started getting mixing and mastering jobs, asked to do remixes, my artist releases took off, and every one of them was a plateau smashing tip that really had a marked improvement in my music career. Thankfully, I put them all in this video here because I wish someone had shown me when I was starting. It would have saved me years. So you can avoid that frustration by checking them out. I guarantee your mixes are going to sound way better after you apply these tips. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you over at that next video.